Alrighty, good evening, everybody. Welcome back out. Appreciate y'all making the trip out on Sunday evening. Tonight we are actually diving into the documents, and so I've got the book set out here for anybody that wants to take a look at that. Just a heads up on this. It's very old, that much is obvious. I don't think this is the original document. A couple reasons on that. The first reason is that they actually record in this book several months into it that they purchased a church book. So they didn't have a book when they started, but this book has all the notes in it from the start. So I don't think that this is original to those meetings. Also, even when it has signatures, it seems to me at least all the signatures are in the same handwriting. They all seem to have like a lean to the right where somebody, writes that way. All the letters are about the same size. So this seems like this is a copy, a very early copy, but a copy nonetheless. So as we get into it, just to be mindful of that, I don't think these are the originals, but very early copies of them, which interestingly, as Christians, is perfectly fine because that's what we have of the Bible. We don't have the originals, we have very early copies, and we know they're reliable too. So, fun stuff there. As we get started, I want to dive into this. First of all, our sign that's over the front door there will testify to you that Antioch was formally constituted 26th of September, 1818. That was the first meeting that we were constituted as a church. The founding presbytery came together and actually said this is a independent church now. We've talked about how that we were a plant that was planted by Center Baptist out on whatever that road is that you all know that I don't. But Center Baptist planted us September 26, 1818 was our first week as an independent church. But they spent the entirety of that first meeting setting out two things. First of all, who are the members here? And secondly, what do we believe? So they spend that whole first meeting just on our abstract of principles, that statement of faith, and the membership roll. It's not until the next month, which is October 24th rather of 1818, that they actually named the church. So the first meeting, we were simply called the Church of Jesus Christ at Wolf Lick Meeting House. That was the name of the church. It's not until October of that year that we become Antioch. And it's not even the first thing they did at that meeting. So October, they met according to adjournment after worship, proceed to business. First, inquired after fellowship. Second, opened the door of the church for the reception of members and received in full fellowship, so on and so forth. Third, chose Brother Daniel Carson to be the church clerk. Fourth, we agreed to call the church by the name of Antioch. So they had plenty of business, and then it's almost like somebody said, hey, we kind of need to name this thing. And so they said, that's a good idea. And so they named it. They named it Antioch. Now, they called it the Church of Jesus Christ at Antioch, or sometimes you'll see the Church of Christ at Antioch. The reason that they could call it that is because there was no such thing as the Church of Christ yet. That was not a denomination. Alexander Campbell and the Restorationists, or the Church of Christ as we now know them, did not exist. They hadn't come along yet. Alexander Campbell was here, but he had no such movement yet. So that you could call yourselves just the Church of Jesus Christ or the Church of Christ, and that not be a denomination. But they called themselves that, the Church of Christ at Antioch. Why they chose the name Antioch, they don't spell out. They don't tell you why Antioch. They just say we agreed to be called by the name Antioch. I have a theory. I wouldn't be a historian if I didn't have a theory. So my theory is that they were aligning us with the Church of Antioch in the Bible, not just in name, but that church was one of the first church plants of the church at Jerusalem. It was off in the wilderness. It was the only church out there. And so when they looked at Antioch in those days, it would make sense to me that they would look at Antioch and think, this is kind of like the Church of Antioch in the Bible. We're one of the first church plants in this area. We're out in the woods kind of church with not a lot of churches around us. So they just went with Antioch. That's my theory, at least. I don't have a better one. But one of the things that's pretty neat to look at is the way they did business. So their business was very, very legalistic, not in the terms of the word that we use for doctrine, like you're legalistic as in you have to follow the law. They were legalistic as in it seems like they were lawyers. The way that they did their business was the way that it was done in court settings. So they would begin by saying, the Church of Jesus Christ at Wolf Lick Meeting House met according to adjournment, and after worship proceeded to business, first inquired after fellowship. That term, met according to adjournment, that's how they enter every single meeting. Every time they start a meeting, they say, the Church of Jesus Christ at Antioch met according to adjournment. And I didn't know what that meant. I'd never heard that phrase before reading this. Adjournment to me means we can leave. And so to say we met according to adjournment didn't make any sense. So I started looking into that. And that was a legal term that was used in the late 1700s, early 1800s that introduced court meetings or official meetings. An interesting one, the Olive Branch Petition, if you've ever heard of this. It was the last letter that Congress sent to King George before the Declaration of Independence. It was sent on the 5th of July, 1775, so a full year before the Declaration of Independence. It's the last letter they sent to him asking him to stop this conflict that they had. And the Olive Branch Petition begins, Congress met according to adjournment. So this is a legal term. They seem to know what they're talking about in terms of courts and things like that. They also open every meeting with, we inquired as to fellowship. That's it. First, inquired after fellowship. Now what that means is, they just asked everybody how they felt about everybody else in the church. So that was the first thing they did in every meeting. Does anybody have a problem with anybody else in this room? Can you imagine starting a business meeting that way? Before we start our business meeting tonight, we need to first of all handle this. Does anybody have anything against another person here? That's how they'd start every single meeting. For a good period of time, there was no problems, but they came up at points, and we'll talk about those later. Then they would open the door of the church, and that just meant that they were inviting people to come forward as candidates for membership. That's how they termed that. We'll open the door of the church. You could come as a member one of three ways. You could come by baptism, obviously. You could come with a letter from another church. But the third one's a little different. Today we would say we come by statement of faith. You would come by examination. That's how you would come back then. You couldn't just say, I'm a Christian and I don't have a letter from another church, but I've been baptized. You would come under examination. So you would provide some candidacy. You would say, I want to be a member. I've been baptized. I'm a Christian. And the pastors would take you aside and examine you. And they would ask you what you believed and about your Christian experience. And then they would make a recommendation to the church on whether or not to receive you. So that's a little bit different. Although not all that different from what we do now. When I talk to people about membership, I do membership interviews with them. And then by the time they stand in front of you guys, I've already spoken with them twice about what they believe in their Christian experience. So getting a little closer to what they were doing then nowadays. Let's see here. Moving on. Okay, as soon as Antioch was constituted, we started adding a lot of members. And I know this isn't easy to see. I didn't know of a better way of doing this than to just list them like this. But you can obviously see this list other places, or I can get it to you if you're interested in knowing some of these names. But very early on, they start adding people. You have your founding 10, James Conyers, Philip Warden, William Tatum, Daniel Carson, his wife, who a lot of the time the wives are not named. They would just say Daniel Carson and wife, or they would say Mrs. Daniel Carson. That's not an antiquated idea. That's within the lifetime of people in this church. That was very common. Elijah Solomon, Southie Rayfield, John Danks, John Driscoll, and Mrs. John Driscoll. These are our founding 10 members, 8 men and 2 women. But very early, they start adding members quickly. So the second meeting we ever had, October 1818, Pressel Holt, I've got a hunch that might have been Presley, but it's recorded as Pressel in the notes. Ann Rayfield, they both come as members in October. The next month, Polly Floyd and James Vance. January, Jacob Bauer and his wife joined. He was voted in as pastor in November, but he wasn't ordained. So he had to get ordained. He was ordained in February. So he came and joined the church in January and officially became one of the pastors here in February. Thomas Sherrod, Mary Dollison, and Mary Sutton Danks also all joined in January. Samuel Ross and his wife Judy joined in February. Thomas Powell, Unity Sherrod, Sally Sherrod, Alexander Carson, Ave Carson, his wife, David Edwards, Mrs. David Edwards. A couple of colored folks that don't have last names, Haim and Lucy and June, David Brannon, James B. Vance, and Letty Solomon. A lot of last names we don't have here. So you have a lot of families that are not here anymore. And that can be explained in a variety of ways, but the point I'm making is that early on, Antioch really grew quickly in terms of it. This is the first year. So from September of 18 to September of 19, they added 23 new members. And also, we've said this before, bear in mind that all the men in these lists, if you count just the men, you're probably representing 5 to 7 more people between their wife, their children, and probably their slaves. So if you just counted the men here and multiply that by 5 or 7, you'd have a pretty big group, probably about the size of what we have now, if not a little more. So the church grew very quickly, especially after Jacob Bauer came to be the pastor. So we need to give him a lot of credit as an early church pastor here for growing the church really, really well. When he was ordained in February, William Tatum, who was one of the founding presbyters, they actually wrote in the documents that he was set at liberty, which means that he was still one of the pastors here. They had those original 3 pastors. When they added Jacob Bowers in, they let him go, and the reason they let him go was to plant other churches. And so William Tatum is one of the founding pastors at Mount Pleasant in Lewisburg. And so when you read our documents, you could get confused because it would say William Tatum was a pastor here, and it would also say he was a pastor out there. Well, he was released from here to pastor out there. They also, at the February meeting where they ordained Jacob Bauer, they licensed Daniel Carson to preach. So they had guys that were being licensed to preach, sent out to plant churches. It was a very evangelistic church. Many of the people here in the church in the early days were very evangelistic, and obviously lots of them felt the call to preach, felt the call to ministry, although they all also had full-time jobs. So William Tatum, for example, he's a big-time farmer in the area and came from a preaching family, but he was a big-time farmer in between Russellville and Lewisburg, and everybody really respected him as a farmer. They thought he was a great example of a farmer and took a lot of advice from him on farming, but he was also a big-time minister. I've actually got a copy of a letter he wrote. We'll talk about that in a minute. On the topic of leaders, though, Antioch for the first 6 months did not have any deacons. We didn't ordain deacons until March of 1819. And when we did, it was problematic. It was actually pretty hard to find deacons because of what they wanted out of deacons. So in March of 1819, they select Samuel Ross and John Driscoll, this is their quote, to use the office of deacons if found authentic. So they get together, they call for help from Providence Church, which was one of the first churches in this area as well, and they get together James Conyers and Jacob Bowers, who were both pastors here, to do this ordination service in May. They get to the ordination service and they go down to do the examination of John Driscoll and Samuel Ross. And they come up, and what they write in the notes is what you see here. It says, agreeable to our former request to Providence, James Conyers and Jacob Bowers came forward to ordain our deacons, and finding Brother Samuel Ross authentic, ordained him. And Brother Driscoll, not being established in the 4th article of the Constitution, was not ordained, but the church agreed to wait with him for further consideration. So they get all the way to the examination, and Samuel Ross passes the test, and John Driscoll doesn't, because he will not affirm the 4th article of our statement of faith. The same thing happens a couple years later. In March of 1822, there's a guy named Nimrod Duncan who is put forward for ordination. They do the examination of him. He will not affirm the 4th article, and so they don't ordain him. So the question is, what was the 4th article? What was it that these guys would not affirm? The 4th article of the statement of faith said, we believe in the doctrine of election and that God chose his people in Christ before the foundation of the world. It was Calvinism. These guys did not believe Calvinism. And so the church as a whole said, we will not allow you to be a deacon if you're not a Calvinist. And we even spent a whole evening on the movement that the church underwent with Calvinism and how quickly that happened. We'll talk a little more about that tonight because it does have a lot to do with this early history. But by the time you get to 1843, the church has really backed up on Calvinism, kind of softened that. And interestingly, in 1823, March of 1823, those two guys, Nimrod Duncan and John Driscoll, who they would not ordain because they weren't Calvinists, in March of 1823, they ordained both of them. And so they reversed themselves. And they were saying you couldn't be a deacon if you weren't a Calvinist, but by 1823, they reversed that and they ordained these fellas. And so we're going to talk a bit tonight about why that rapid change happened. But by the time you get to 1843, they rewrite the Statement of Faith, they soften the Calvinism a lot, and the four pastors of Antioch in 1843 sign it. And importantly, one of the first signers, one of the pastors, is John Driscoll, who was one of those guys that they would not ordain because he wasn't a Calvinist. So you get that Statement of Faith changing. The first guy to sign it, who would be considered probably the lead pastor, is John Christian. So here you have that Christian family making their way in by the 1840s, and the church is backing off of Calvinism. In June of 1818, Antioch votes to join the Red River Association. It's our first association, our first Baptist association, the local one. Bear in mind, the Southern Baptist Convention didn't exist at this point. The Kentucky Baptist Convention didn't exist either. So local associations were all you had. But the local associations back then were gigantic compared to what they are now. So on this map, this blue area is our association now. That's the Logan Todd Association. Everything in the red was the Red River Association. So this is everything from south of Nashville all the way up to the Illinois border. That was all one association. And that's going to play a part in a minute. Associational meetings were a big deal back then. People would get on horseback and ride for days to go to an associational meeting. The pastors would bring letters from their churches talking about issues they had, problems they were facing, doctrinal questions they had. And they would ask the association, and the pastors would write these letters where they were addressing the issues brought forward, and they would send them back. And so if you remember our section on slavery, remember the associations were putting out these letters saying, don't talk about slavery. And that was why, because these pastors were showing up with questions, and the association would write these letters back. So they would get together, talk about doctrine, evangelism, missions, church planning. And that's all fine and good. And so far, everything's going really well at Antioch, a year in. But in the fall of 1819, things start becoming problems. And you start having people during that section of the business meeting where they would say, let's check on the fellowship of the church, people start speaking up. The fall of 1819, people start bringing charges against other people, and they become increasingly problematic. June of 1820, Alexander Carson, who joined all of 1 year earlier, him and his wife bring a charge against Samuel Ross and his wife. They don't specify what the charge was, but whatever it was, the church couldn't authenticate it right then and there. So they put a committee of men together, some of the pastors and deacons, and they asked them to inquire into this, and at the next meeting come back with all the people and tell us what you've decided. Well, at the next meeting, what they come down to is they say, Brother Ross will be maintained in good fellowship. Sister Ross will be maintained in good fellowship. Alexander Carson will be maintained in good fellowship. His wife Ave will be excommunicated. Yeah. Now you mind, they're the ones that brought the charges. So you make an accusation against another person. Alexander, they say, you're cool. You've done nothing wrong. But your wife is gone. So that was the first time Antioch did church discipline to the point of excluding somebody. However, can you imagine the ride home for poor Alex? It's like, well, that's awkward, huh? You know, and he did. So Here's the thing, though. It didn't take long. Very soon after, Alexander ends up getting excommunicated for being a drunk. And at that meeting, he acknowledges that he's been drinking and that he's been getting drunk. Drinking they didn't have any problem with. They said becoming intoxicated with spiritual liquors. That was the way they worded it. He's been becoming intoxicated with spiritual liquors. And he acknowledged that he had been getting drunk. But the church, this is their words, they say, we deem his acknowledgement not sufficient to maintain him in fellowship and therefore have excluded him. So even though he admitted that he was getting drunk, they say it wasn't enough. So they excluded him anyway. But this church discipline, once it started, it never ended. Okay, and both in individual cases and as a whole, there are instances where somebody would be a charge raised against them, and they would say, well, we want them to be here at the next meeting. And the next meeting would come a month later and they wouldn't show up. And they say, well, we want them to come at the next meeting. And they wouldn't come again, and they wouldn't come again. And you would have 8 or 9 months where every meeting they were addressing this problem. Sometimes tedious thing. And yet they'd spend 8 or 9 months addressing it in the church. What happens is the church becomes pretty exhausted with this. So in October of 1820, they call for a fast. They call the whole church to go into a season of fasting. The church becomes so small that they stop meeting at the Wolf Lick Meeting House. They start just meeting at people's houses because the church has shrunk so much. They meet at the house of J.D. Sutton, Robert Sherrod, Rodham Priest, Reuben Browning, and Zechariah Duncan because they don't have enough people to really justify meeting at the meeting house. The church has gotten so small so fast. They would proclaim another fast in 1822, right before the associational meeting. We'll talk about that in a second. But that was a pretty common thing. When something was really, really bad, they would call for a fast. November of 1820, that's when John Danks, where's he at? John, where'd you go? Other here. Oh, he's on the original. Okay, so he's an old-timer. Thank you. John Danks levels a charge against Alexander Carson for getting drunk, and he's excluded. That's in November. And so now Alexander and his wife Aid have both been excommunicated. 4 years later, February of 1824, Alexander comes forward in front of the church and repents of being drunk. And the church receives him back into fellowship. That's in February. In July of 1824, his wife Aid shows up and repents of lying about Judy and Sam Ross, which happened 4 years before. She admits that she lied, repents to the church, and she's received back into the church. 4 years it took for them to come back. But they came back and they were received back. And that's actually how most church discipline worked. Is you would have some sin raised, the person would acknowledge it most often, the church would either accept their acknowledgement or not. If they didn't, they'd exclude them. And after some time, the person would come back, repent of what they'd done, and the church would receive them back. That's usually how it works. So very odd. Most of the charges that came up were either for lying, which we would today probably call gossip. So they brought forward people often for gossip or lying and drunkenness. Those were the two main things that they brought people forward on. The church discipline process worked. It kept people honest, and people would be excluded or brought into the church, but most often they'd be reconciled. It worked, but it was exhausting, and it did not do the church any favors. From November of 1819 to January of 1822, the church received not one member. So you think about this. From October of 1818 to September of 19, they received 23 new members, almost every month people joining. And from November of 1819 to January of 1822, no new members. Just nothing for 2.5 years. after that kind of growth. And the thing that really changed everything was this church discipline. They were so exhausted by it. At some points, the church even said, we're not opening the door of the church to new members right now, because they were exhausted by this. They didn't want the trouble. So the church discipline was a good thing to have, but the execution of it was so exhausting. The way they did it was just exhausting. And it wouldn't be outside the realm of realistic to say it almost killed the church. It got so small it almost killed it. Now, we were talking about associations. We have talked about in the past how that in the 1700s, most Baptists were Calvinists, and they were what you'd even call hyper-Calvinist, where they didn't believe in doing missions, they didn't believe in evangelism. They thought, well, God's chosen who He's going to save, and that's the end of it, so we don't need to do any of that stuff. And in the late 1700s, you have this kickback against that. And we've talked about Adoniram Judson and his wife, who were missionaries, early Baptist missionaries. Talked about William Carey, who founded the China Inland Mission. We talked about Andrew Fuller, who really pushed against that theologically. And so by the time you get to the early 1800s, you have three groups of Baptists. You have what were called then Calvinists, which today we'd call hyper-Calvinists. They believe in no missions. They believe in no evangelism. You had what they called Fullerites, who were people like Andrew Fuller, who they were Calvinists, but they believed in missions, they believed in evangelism, they believed in going around telling people the gospel. And then you had Arminians, who rejected Calvinism altogether. There were barely any Arminians at all, not in the Baptist world. There were almost none. The Fullerites, these Calvinists that believed in missions, really start growing quickly in the early 1800s. In 1814, Americans established what they called the Baptist Board of Foreign Missions. It was a group of Baptists coming together to fundraise and send missionaries out. That Baptist Board of Foreign Missions would soon be renamed. They called it the Triennial Convention because they met every 3 years. And in 1845, the Triennial Convention split over the issue of slavery. And you ended up with two Baptist conventions, the Northern Baptist Convention and the Southern Baptist Convention. So hence you have the SBC. The Northern Baptist Convention, by the way, still exists. It's called the American Baptist Convention. So this Baptist Board of Foreign Missions is the forerunner of what we now call the Southern Baptist Convention. And they came together to send churches a letter asking them to send funding to send missionaries all over the world. So at these associational meetings, they would have those letters presented, and they would even have people come into local churches and say, we're going to ask you to send money to the Baptist Board of Foreign Missions to send missionaries out. And so you have the first sort of mission boards. Needless to say, the old guard Calvinists did not like that idea because they didn't like missions. They didn't believe in mission work. They didn't believe in evangelism. They did not like that. The problem was the arguments that they had always used to fight against that didn't work anymore, because the guys who were leading these mission groups were Calvinists. So they couldn't say, we believe in election, so we don't do missions. Those guys would say, we believe in election, and we do missions. We believe in predestination, and we believe that we should be sending missionaries out. So those arguments did not work anymore. So they had to come up with new arguments. They came up really with two arguments for why they didn't believe in doing missions. The first one, which was forwarded by John Taylor, who we've talked about here before, he said the local church should be responsible for sending out and funding missionaries, not parachurch ministries. The reason for that is he said, if you send a missionary out from a church and the church is funding them, the church can also inquire about the doctrine they're teaching. And if they teach heresy, the church can withdraw their funding and the person will be cut off. But if a parachurch ministry, like a mission board, is sending missionaries out, and all these churches are paying into it, then they have no idea what's being taught on the other end of the line. And so if the person's teaching heresy, the churches funding it don't know. And they'll be paying for somebody to teach heresy. That was his reasoning. That argument, on the face of it, is actually a pretty good argument. And he wrote a book in 1820 called Thoughts on Missions that was really popular here in Kentucky. And so he was the lead guy among frontier Baptists against mission work, against missionaries. The other reason that they gave, the other argument for not doing mission work, was a lot more crazy. But it was actually the more popular reason. It finds its origin in 1820 with a guy named Daniel Parker. Daniel Parker, as he appears, was insane. He was an absolute crazy person. He forwarded a doctrine that was absolutely bananas. We'll spend some time talking about it, but a little bit about him first. He pastored a church just across the Indiana line. And remember, the Red River Association goes all the way up to that Illinois-Indiana area. So he was somewhat known in this area. He was a Southerner, even though he lived up there. He was born in Georgia, so he was more acceptable to slave-owning Southerners in our area. He was had a very Southern drawl. He had no formal education. One man described him as being uncouth in manners, slovenly in dress, diminutive in person, unprepossessing in appearance. He had shriveled features and a small piercing eye. But he's also noted as being a very influential figure. Lower class, less educated people really thought highly of him. When he preached, they said that he had a lot of zeal. He was enthusiastic. One person said he was enthusiastic to the point of bordering on insanity. He was a very, very I hate to make this comparison, but think of Hitler. Very enthusiastic, very, wildly enthusiastic to the point where you're either going to say he's crazy or people will just come to him in droves. That was the way that Daniel Parker was. In 1820, he writes a book called Views on the Two Seeds. He initially entitled it A Public Address to the Baptist Society and Friends of Religion in General on the Principle and Practice of the Baptist Board of Foreign Missions for the United States of America. So he's actively coming after the mission board. And his argument in that was that he vehemently opposed missions, and he gives his reasoning for it with this doctrine of the two seeds. He comes to the Red River Association, which met in Logan and Todd County at points, and he preached in 1821 about the two-seed doctrine and why we shouldn't support missions. When he preached there, it was at the 1820 meeting. When he preached at that 1820 meeting, it set our association on fire. There was a major conflict that resulted from that. They always had their associational meetings in June, but his June sermon seems to have really started a division among the churches. The next year, things just became worse. In June of 1821, the Red River Association has a major fight breakout. Messengers returning from that meeting to Antioch in July of 1821, they meet, and in the minutes, it says they start pointing fingers at each other, saying that this person or that person is the reason that the Baptists in our area are fighting. They don't blame Daniel Parker. They blame other people. And so in July of 1821, Elijah Solomon and his wife began accusing and blaming the wrong man of being the reason that all this is going on. And so because they're accusing somebody whose fault it is not, the church executes church discipline and excludes both of them for lying. And that disciplinary process continues until January of 1822, before anybody would ever admit that a mistake had been made. In the minutes, Elijah and Sedis Solomon are said to have blamed somebody for all the distress. So what was the distress? What happened at that 1820 meeting? What did Daniel Parker say that was so distressing? Well, we know Parker was against missionary funding. He wrote clearly against that in that 1820 pamphlet. But surely one person's opinion of whether we should be funding missionaries or not wouldn't just split whole churches and whole associations. There was surely a bigger problem, and there were two sides of this debate. Somebody described this issue, Sister Solomon, that was Mr. Solomon's wife here at Antioch. She described this and she said, people should keep their children away from people who believe that. They don't describe what's being said in the minutes. They simply say, Sister Solomon said children should be kept away from anyone teaching this. Okay, so this was a big deal. What was most likely to have been the distressing problem was this doctrine of the two seeds. This is what Daniel Parker preached at the 1820 meeting. The two-seed doctrine was this. He taught that Eve had two sons that survived. The first was Cain, the second was Seth. Obviously, Cain kills Abel. So you have Cain and you have Seth. Daniel Parker took Genesis 3:15, where God says to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. And he taught that Eve had had children by two different seeds, meaning two different men. The one seed, that would be the promised seed through whom the Messiah would come, was through Seth. And Seth's father was Adam. Adam was made in the image of God. And so the children of Seth bear on their bodies the image of God. They are the children of God. The other seed, the father of Cain, he says, is, according to Genesis 3:15, your seed being the seed of the devil. So when God says to Satan, I will put enmity between your seed and her seed, he's saying, your son Cain and my child Seth will be enemies forever. And so he taught that Cain was literally the child of the devil, that Eve had copulated with Satan, and that Satan's son Cain had had children down through the ages. And so there are two groups of people. There are the children of the devil, and there are the children of God. And when Jesus in the New Testament looks at the Pharisees and he says, you are like your father the devil, he meant it. And when he prays with his disciples, our Father who art in heaven, he meant it, because God is their Father. He's not the father of the children of the devil. And that line has proceeded down all the way to the modern day, such that there are people walking amongst us who bear in their blood the seed of the devil. And there are some of us walking amongst who bear in our blood the seed of God. That's what he taught. And as a result of that, of course, there is no reason to do evangelism or missions, because they're the children of the devil. And so if you bring people into the church who are the children of the devil, you're trying to bring the devil's children into the family of God. And you'll pollute God's good seed. And of course, the hyper-Calvinists, who believe in a group called the elect, the foreordained, the predestined, they ate it up. Because when he says the children of the devil, they hear the non-elect. And when he says the children of God, they hear the elect. And it agrees with what they theologically believed. And of course, there was no reason to do evangelism because they're not elect, and he just calls them the devil's seed. That makes sense. And so, they ate it. The children of God are destined to go to heaven. The children of the devil are destined to go to hell. The children of God are good people. The children of the devil are bad people. The children of God are wise. The children of the devil are foolish. The children of God have produced, while the children of the devil have destroyed. The big problem, one of the gigantic problems was that this is passed on genetically. Obviously, it's in your blood. So, how do you identify somebody that's the seed of the devil? Well, they're people that don't go to church. They don't believe in God. And if they don't, that's their problem. They got it from their parents, and there's nothing we can do about it. They'll pass it on to their children because they're the children of the devil. And that's why Christians can't marry outside of Christianity. You're not allowed to be unequally yoked to non-Christians because you'll pollute God's seed with the seed of the devil. You see how they put this whole system together? You see how gross this is? This is what he taught. And he preaches this at the Red River Association, and it lights the whole place on fire because many people believe it and they agree with it. James Ross, who was there at that associational meeting in 1820, he describes how it happened. He says, Elder Parker was a small, dry-looking man of a gypsy type. He had black eyes and hair and dark complexion. He rose to the pulpit to speak, and he soon gave us the understanding that he meant business. He pulled off his coat, he pulled off his vest, he laid them deliberately on the pulpit beside him, he unbuttoned his shirt collar, and after preparation, it is almost incredible with what ease and fluency he spoke. He seemed full of his subject. He went through it in a way that truly seemed wonderful. He was an able man in this way, but afterwards he gave his Calvinistic brethren a great deal of trouble from which they have never recovered. This famous two-seed doctrine originated with him, which heresy shook the churches to their foundations. That's what happened. He gets up and he shares this doctrine, and the churches are decimated over it. And people come back to Antioch the next year, and they're pointing fingers trying to figure out whose fault this is. And this woman, Mrs. Solomon, says, we cannot let our children hear this doctrine. We cannot let our children hear this. And it almost destroys Antioch. You might be thinking, well, who in the world would believe that? And why? Well, here's the thing. A lot of Christians believed that because of these presuppositions they had, but another reason they believed it was because the medical community got behind it. Now, bear in mind, this whole theory is medically based. You're the seed of the devil. It's in your blood. And we're the seed of God. It's in your blood. Well, a guy named Charles Caldwell, who just so happens to be the founder of the University of Louisville's medical school, who was a professor there at the time, writes a book called The Thoughts on the Original Unity of the Human Race, in which he says there are different races of humans divided by bloodline. We did not all come from Adam. He's a Christian. In this book, he defends the fact that we were all created by God, but he says we did not all come from Adam. It's clear by the medical research we are not all the same group. There are different groups of people. And conveniently, can you imagine which groups he said were not part of the same family? Would you have guessed the blacks? He says that Caucasians and Africans did not come from a common ancestor. He wrote an entire book on this, saying that we came from different ancestors. He was committed to the creation story, but somehow he believed that God had created people from different original individuals. And so, of course, when Daniel Parker introduces his idea of the two seeds, the medical community comes in and says, that's it. That's how we got these different groups of humans. We're all created by God, yes, but not all from Adam. It's because the blacks are the children of the devil. So you have the theological community and the medical community agreeing on this. And the churches just fell apart over it. You have so many factors here. The hyper-Calvinists obviously loved it. Frontier people really loved it. It appealed to their racism. It appealed to this idea that we're not like the blacks and we have a right to oppress them. Understand, as a Christian, if there are people who are the children of the devil, you would be completely justified in enslaving them. They're the children of the devil. So of course they used that as justification. It appealed to them. They're not the same as us in terms of humanity because they're not bearing the image of God. They're the children of the devil. And you get all these factors together, and two-seedism becomes very, very popular, specifically in Kentucky. It's very, very popular. When the camera's turned off, I'll tell you, there is a church in our area that still teaches it today. And you will know the pastor. It's very close to here. They still teach that. I've talked to their pastor about it. This is still here. It was not until after the Civil War that people stopped really popularly believing this, and it was because other scholars like John Watson began publishing that was nonsense. John Watson was a pastor, but he was also a physician and a professor of medicine. He was the chair of the Department of Obstetrics, one or the other, at the University of Tennessee. Can you imagine being a professor at a medical school and having to write a book that says, the African people are not the children of the devil? He had to. He wrote this book, The Old Baptist Test. Notice, this is a medical book, and he's writing it to Baptists specifically because we were the ones teaching this nonsense. And so he combats that. But by the time he writes this book, 1867, Daniel Parker's already been dead for 20 years. And the people that heard him preach this for decades, they're convinced. And so it stayed for a long time. And obviously the residue of it is still here today. Daniel Parker was also the first person to bring a Baptist church to Texas. And that's where he died. And they still commemorate him as a Baptist hero in Texas, which is insane. So, when this issue was preached at 1820 at the Red River Association, it set the association on fire. And churches went home and argued about it. Antioch was one of them. The next year, a vote was held at the associational meeting on whether or not to divide the association on people who believed in two-seed and people who didn't. Those votes kept happening. In the minutes at Antioch in 1821, Antioch as a church voted not to divide the association. We didn't want to divide the association. They vote again in 1822, and again they vote not to divide the association. Antioch again voted not to divide the association. 1823, they come back, and Antioch, instead of voting on that issue again, just voted to leave. And so, before the associational meeting of 1823, Antioch again devoted time for solemn fasting and prayer to Almighty God. That's their quote. They clearly understood the gravity of this situation. And so, Antioch votes to leave the association in 1823 and become members of the Gasper River Association. Probably just tired of the fight. They got out just in time. In 1823, there was a coup attempt by the two-seed guys to take over the association. It failed, but the lead man who kept it from succeeding was a guy named Reuben Ross. Next time you're driving into Clarksville, as you're coming out of Guthrie and coming into Clarksville, where the new Amazon distribution center is on your left, there is a historic marker on your right to Reuben Ross, who was a pastor in Logan County, the leader of our association for, I think, close to 30 years. Big time figure. And what he said was in 1825, they divided the association. The Red River Association became what's called a non-missionary association. That's actually here on the family tree. Red River, now anti-missionary. And from them comes in 1825 the Bethel Association. Bethel Association believed in doing missions. Red River no longer did. It's because they just gave it to the two-seed guys. And they went and started their own association called the Bethel Baptist Association, which in many of your lifetime, you remember the Bethel Baptist Association. Now it's the Logan Todd. So the Bethel Baptist Association was started in 1825 as a result of this split because they believed in missions. Reuben Ross led that association, but here's how he did it. In order to guard against those two-seed guys, he simply said, no Calvinists. So the Fullerites, who believed in doing missions, but also believed in Calvinism, he says, you're too close to them. They seem to be what you are. None of that. And so when he starts the Bethel Baptist Association, he says no Calvinism. Absolutely no Calvinism. And he would lead that association until 1850. So 25 years under him. And so it's no surprise that Logan County for the longest time had no Calvinism in it. Because he simply said, you cannot call yourself a Baptist and be Calvinist. I won't allow it. How did Antioch approach these things? We didn't join the Bethel Association for several years. We did ultimately join that association. Where did Antioch come down on the two-seed doctrine? Well, the two-seed doctrine required two things: a rejection of mission work and a belief that different human races represented different ancestors in the garden, God and the devil. Now, obviously, Mrs. Solomon didn't believe in two-seed doctrine because she said, we can't let our children even hear this. But the church as a whole, how did the church feel about it? How did we approach missions and race? Here's how we covered it. When you look at the race issue, Antioch very early on had colored members. As early as January of 1819, I've got that wrong, January of 1819, so this is all of 3 months into Antioch being a church, Mary Sutton Danks joins the church. She's a free black. She lived at Tunstall, which this is the first time I've ever heard of that as a unique community. You guys have heard of Tunstall School here across the road, 106 there. Evidently, that was a community of its own. So she lived in Tunstall, and she joined the church in January of 1819. Soon after, we read that on the slide before, a guy named Haim, who was a free man of color, joined. Same month, Lucy, a free woman of color, joined. Pretty soon after, John Ashburn, who was a slave of Henry Ashburn, he joins the church. And Winnie Priest, who was a slave of Rodham Priest, joined the church as well. And that's stretching from January of 1819 through to April of 1824. That encompasses the two-seed controversy. So all the way through this two-seed controversy, Antioch continues to accept black members into the church, which indicates very clearly we did not believe that they were the children of the devil. That was not something that was ever believed here. Secondly, you can look at Antioch's approach to missions. Not only did we join the Gasper River Association, but February of 1819, we granted a license to Daniel Carson to preach the gospel, sent him out to preach the gospel. February, we send William Tatum out to plant more churches. February of 1822, we gave a license to John Ashburn to preach the gospel. By the way, remember, who's John Ashburn? He's a slave. So we were not only allowing blacks to come into membership, we were licensing them to preach and sending them out to preach the gospel. The late 1800s, and this is what actually bears on us now, Antioch in the late 1800s, alongside Center Baptist and Hazel Creek, changes its name to Antioch Missionary Baptist Church, so that everyone will be aware of where we stand on this issue. We are missionary Baptists. That's where that name comes from, was over this divide. It was over the people who didn't believe in mission work and the people who did. And so Antioch very publicly says, we'll change the name of our church to make this clear. We are Antioch Missionary Baptist Church. Now, in all of our signage and advertising, and anytime that I refer to Antioch, I always just refer to us as Antioch Baptist Church, because there's hardly any of these anti-missionary folk anymore. It's not, honestly not really all that important of a distinction anymore. But on paper, Antioch is still Antioch Missionary Baptist Church. That's the name of this church. And that's why. Is because this conflict was so divisive, the people at Antioch wanted to make very clear where they stood. We were not two-seed people. They wanted everybody to know that. So that is a jet tour of everything that goes on in this book from start to finish. Like I said, this is the shortest book by far, like 30-something pages. But a lot happened in those early years. It was a very weird time to plant a church because all that happened immediately. So it's a wonder that Antioch survived those early years, because of everything that happened between the church discipline fiascos and the two-seed issue and all that. It is a miracle. It is a work of God that Antioch survived those years as a church plant. And so we're here, the benefit of a miracle of God to maintain this church. Any questions or comments on any of that? Isn't that stuff insane? You think we've got crazy people today. I mean, our biggest thing is should women be allowed to be pastors? And it's like, they thought black people were the children of the devil. And the medical community backed it. We have small problems, This is the era we live in. We've got small problems compared to what they were fighting back then. Right. Yeah, red people, black people, they're not demon children. No, that was a ridiculous idea. But a lot of people bought it. Right. Yeah, it mattered what they believed, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, from the mouth of babes. The color didn't matter. It mattered what they believed. Exactly. Yeah. All right. I'll turn this off. You turn that.